explorers traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean islands were inhabited by Amerindian tribes that harmoniously coexisted with the earth and the wild. These amicable human beings lived a life of peace and generosity. In 1498, on his third journey across the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus and his Spanish fleet stumbled upon a beautiful island with 3 mountain peaks in the distance. Columbus named it Trinidad. Little did the Amerindians know the arrival of the Spaniards would mark the end of their rural lifestyle and the beginning of a series of raids among European nations that would not end until the islands of Trinidad and Tobago eventually became a British colony in 1797. As the number of European inhabitants of the island increased, so too did the number of African slaves brought to harvest sugarcane. Although the slaves were not wealthy, they brought with them their rich cultural heritage. interplantation communication could be achieved via coded messages produced through drumming and dance. Furthermore, hand drumming was part of the Africans' non-Christian religious rituals. In an attempt to convert the Africans to Catholicism, the use of drums covered with animal skins was banned. Forbidden to create music with their drums, the slaves turned to an abundant plant on the island that seemed made for hitting: bamboo. These rhythm sections were appropriately named tambour bamboo, which in French translates to bamboo drum. The largest bamboo were called booms. The slender and taller bamboo tapped on the ground were called the full. The skinny pieces of bamboo played over the shoulders and held in hands were called cutters. Bamboo bands were also accompanied by bottles and spoons, pots, pans, and even buckets. When the bamboo bands did not march through the streets, they played their rhythms in yards. It's in these yards that gangs of youth would gather and bang out rhythms on whatever was available, while an old African tradition of kalimba, or stick fighting, was practiced around a fire pit. In 1937, although slavery had been abolished for almost a century, the British passed a law banning the tambour bamboo bands. The metal beating bands soon took over. The rhythm section was now moved from the bamboo to metal, and the boom transformed from a large piece of bamboo to a large biscuit tin. Contrary rhythms transitioned from the fullers and putters to metal barrels of varying sizes. a simple melodic pattern. Eventually, these gangs of musicians were able to establish pitches on their metal drums, and melodies begin to form. The demand for oil rapidly increased as the war intensified, which in turn increased drilling in the southern part of the island. The oil was transported to the naval base in 55-gallon drums. Soon after the war, the only acoustic musical instrument to be invented in the 20th century would be made from discarded 55-gallon oil drums. In 1946, Winston Spree Simon brought recognition to the instrument with a rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria on his 14-note ping-pong pan.